All right. Thank you all for being here. I feel very special to see all of you as members of the Jeremy Fricke fan club. You. Just teasing. So I have not practiced this presentation anywhere near as much as any of the others, so it's going to be kind of casual in some ways. But I really want to make sure that some of you kind of hear sort of the lessons structured in a way that I think are really important for interfaith dialogue. And you can take them as you will for Tri-Faith Initiative. I'm not going to talk a lot about Tri-Faith Initiative specifically, but more just about what I think really matters and why all of this matters, right? That's my face. If you don't know, I'm Jeremy Fricke. This was actually my first staff photo here in 2019. I just keep using it because people like it. All right. So one of the most important things that I've heard really when thinking about interfaith engagement was actually at Parliament of World Religions. There was a pastor who is known by Alan Bozek. He's a Dutch Reformed minister, anti-apartheid activist from South Africa. And he quotes Alan Paton, who's a fairly famous author on anti-apartheid activism. In this story, Alan Paton writes about a principle during kind of the time before apartheid, just before apartheid, when it was pretty clear where things were going. And this principle was a white principle. He looked, he supervised a mostly Black school. And at the time, he really didn't want to be seen with the students. He was nervous and really worried about the repercussions that might come to him. And over time, people started to see him with the students and eventually even speaking against some of the things that were happening with kind of the early apartheid. And he was asked, why did you change your strategy here? And he said that he had a dream where he was in heaven and the great judge asked, where are your wounds? And he said, you know, what are you talking about? Where are your wounds so that I may heal them? And the principal said, well, I don't have any. And the great judge said, well, then was there nothing worth fighting for? And that has been a really major impact on my life. That little story, right? It's really important to me to make sure that we are doing something worth fighting for. So I grew up in Fremont, Nebraska. I've been in the Midwest basically my whole life. As you know, I'm moving to southern Arizona near the border, which is a pretty significant change from anything that we've been doing. But a lot of that has to do with, you know, let's have some new experiences, right? But grew up in kind of a conservative leaning town. And I actually grew up, even though I'm a white guy, I grew up kind of ethnically ambiguous in my hometown. A lot of people assumed I was Jewish or Muslim or something, especially in the 2000s. And although it wasn't all positive or negative, I started to realize what it might be a little bit like to be different religiously / ethnically. I was part of when I was a teenager, I definitely had some negative feelings even toward the Muslim community. I think, you know, I've gone far away from that today, but I think it's important to recognize that that is part of my story too, right? And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things that took me away from that negativity, but also what I think might work better for interfaith engagement here. So before we kind of get into sort of the lessons of sorts, I want to also make sure we are all on the same page a little bit about what interfaith could mean in the first place. It can mean a lot of different things. In fact, if you talk to different interfaith organizations, whether we're talking Tri-Faith Initiative or something else, most nonprofit interfaith organizations fit into one of these categories. Common service, where you have everyday folks coming together to volunteer. Usually, things, I mean, even actually all four of these are a little bit part of Tri-Faith Initiative right now. So this might be like the community garden, right? That's an easy example. Food pantry, volunteering to serve others. Picnics and potlucks, and what I mean by that is really socials that bring people together of different religious backgrounds. The third, collective advocacy, like when folks come together of different religious backgrounds to advocate for policy change, legislative change, like, maybe food stamp increases or something along those lines, especially for the poor, but it could be for a lot of different reasons. And then finally, religious inclusion for all, which is really about different religious people coming together to support other religious groups, right? And I have a special place in my heart for that fourth one in particular. All of these matter to me, and I think they matter to society. But the fourth one tends to be a little overlooked in my experience, especially when we're looking around the country and around the kind of interfaith sphere. So my first lesson of sorts is that we have a responsibility to engage with others and self-reflect on both making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. Many of you have probably been to our program called Making the Familiar Strange, right? That may or may not have something to do with this, right? Yeah. So, and really we can kind of oversimplify this to, we need to both be able to see commonalities and differences, right? As soon as this is my opinion, as soon as you believe that we all have much more in common than we have different, I want you to think about, well, what about those differences matter to the other person, right? And as soon as you say, well, we have so many differences and I don't know about this commonality, I want you to seek what is similar, right? Always pushing yourself to try to balance those things, right? I don't think we're ever there. It's more of a practice, to always ask that. I grew up, like I said, I grew up, especially after 9/11, I grew up a little bit Islamophobic. And my father actually had friends of different religious backgrounds, which, when you look back and you recognize some of those things, it's interesting. But his best friends were actually a Latino Mormon and a Black Muslim from England. And at the time, I will admit I had some negative feelings toward both of those communities. But I assume that these folks were the exception, right? Right. These are great people. It's just because they're them, and who knows, right? I didn't have a lot of opportunities to engage with a bunch more folks from either of those communities. But when I went to college, I actually was able to engage with another small religious community that I had never heard of before, called the Baha'i Faith. How many of you have heard of the Baha'i Faith? Okay, well, that's pretty good. Oh, I've done part of my job here. So this is actually from Chicago, well, near Chicago, Wilmette. This is the Baha'i community doesn't really have churches. They have like temples on each continent. This is the one for the United States, basically, or the North American one. So the Baha'i faith, although I'm not Baha'i, I will say that. I learned a lot from the Baha'i community, and it came at a time where I was like, I'm doing some personal searching. What even do I believe, right? Because at the time I was kind of thinking, well, these are all the things I don't believe, right? And I think you have to be seeking an affirmative too. the Baha'i faith did introduce a lot of concepts to me that I really appreciate. I never, like I said, I never became Baha'i, but I think we can continue to learn from different religious traditions. Yeah, there was an emphasis on all religions hold some truth. There was an emphasis on the belief that all people can, should, and are equal, right? Alleviation of poverty, things like that. But one thing about the Baha'i faith for me at that time was that it comes from Islam, right? So it sees itself, people who are part of the Baha'i faith see themselves as kind of another step to Islam, right? Like, and to some extent that you have to really be able to accept Islam and the Muslim community in some respect to even really be able to be Baha'i. That is how I understood it at the time. Different people have different experiences. So, I read a bunch of the Baha'i scriptures and things like that, and about all the beauty within the Quran and within Islam itself through kind of what I might call like a side path, right? Why I bring this up is because I believe very strongly that when we are trying to reduce hate or reduce, conflict between different religious communities, we can't do it at the expense of other communities, right? So in my experience, I actually needed to engage with a smaller religious community that had less to do with the community to be able to appreciate Islam, right? Now, before I move on from there, I know there's a lot of words. Is anyone confused? You're confused? Okay, I'll say it one more time. So sometimes when we're trying to reduce conflict between different religious communities, we need to take kind of a side path. Taking another way to empathize with that community. And in this case, and is often the case for a lot of people, it sometimes helps to connect with an entirely different religious community for a moment. Something that they didn't know that they would be able to connect to, right? And then you're able to apply that empathy building to the community that was more difficult to understand, right? Here's a quote. This is Abdul Baha, the son of the founder of the religion. It is evident that ignorance and misunderstanding have caused so much warfare and strife between Christians and Muslims. If both should investigate the underlying truth of their religious beliefs, the outcome would be unity and agreement. Strife and bitterness would pass away forever, and the world of humanity find peace and composure. I'm still very connected with the Baha'i community in Wayne, Nebraska, little Wayne, Nebraska. They still are an important factor in my life, even though I'm not Baha'i. But really the Baha'i faith kind of gave me sort of almost an addiction to empathy. I don't know how else to describe it. It's kind of like, oh, wow, I understand something I did not believe I could understand, right? And that there's kind of a feeling of liberation and of knowledge with that. And really just trying to push the boundaries. Like what else do I have some biases about that I actually think that maybe I could understand them a little better, right? One community that came up for me was the Sikh community or Sikh community. However you want to describe it, it's fine. So the Sikh community has historically been targeted not only for being a smaller religious community, but in America is often seen as Muslim, and particularly some kind of extreme Muslim, because most men wear turbans and have beards and are ethnically ambiguous from South Asia or the Middle East, right? So the Sikh community was something that was very beautiful to me as well. So just to kind of give a couple examples here. I think it was 2008. Yeah, I believe it was 2008. There was the Oak Creek massacre. This happened really at the time that well, I started coming across this story during the time when I was really developing more empathy for marginalized religious communities. Um, Basically a white supremacist who, we don't know all of their motives except that they were a white supremacist, went to the Gurdwara, which is like a Sikh temple, and killed 6 people and ended up mortally injuring a police officer who protected them as well. What I recognized in that is that I knew people in my upbringing, in my college, who said the same things that that the white supremacists said, right? Owl head and other terms that are even worse to say out loud than that. It made me realize that we needed to understand white supremacy more, the groups that counter religious minorities more. But really finding this beauty with Guru Nanak, who's the founder of Sikhism. I see no stranger, I see no enemy, I look upon all with goodwill. The one beloved dwells in all, beholding this wonder I bloom with joy. Guru Nanak is in a context of conflict between Muslims and Hindus, right? He kind of has this sort of revelation of sorts that Muslims and Hindus are able to get along. They're kind of like different songs that are part of the same concert, right? They're different but also very similar. And Sikhism kind of offers a path of appreciating all religions while still having your own religion. Right? So let me see what my next slide is. Like I said, not overly prepared, but here we go. So the kind of next lesson I want to talk about real quick here is that exclusion never creates sustainable inclusion. Right? Now that may seem kind of obvious, but in fact, the vast majority of the situations where people create allies are often against something else, right? So after the Holocaust, there was a great resurgence of interest in interfaith dialogue between Jews and Christians, right? There wasn't a whole lot of interest with Jews, Christians, and Muslims at the time. We focused on Jews and Christians, and it kind of became what we call Judeo-Christianity, right? And kind of became an alliance of Jews and Christians, in some sense against others, over time. Then we added Muslims, right, after 9/11. It took the backlash after the terrorist attacks to add Muslims, right? And we start to see a theme that we don't engage with religious communities until they are victims of serious and significant persecution and discrimination. I really think that we have a responsibility to be more forward-thinking and make sure that we are preparing for, honestly, the next marginalized group to be targeted. I know that's a sad way to look at it, but I do believe we have a responsibility to that. And so to add a little more, I love history stuff. I'm not primarily a historian. I do have a master's degree in religious studies, but I just love this stuff. So thinking about some of the ways that, sorry, it's just jumping around here. That exclusion has been used as a way to kind of create allyships. One of the things that I think of is actually the early Christians. One of the big divides ended up being sort of orthodoxy versus heresy, right? Heresy generally being people who were called Gnostics. And I want to challenge us all to question when people call something or imply that something is heresy. That doesn't mean that there isn't some such a thing in some respect. But it tends to be tossed around against folks who can't really defend themselves historically. So what made Gnostics so controversial in many ways is that they would often understand a story in almost the opposite way, right? They would keep much of the story of like the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, but then shift its understanding. Okay. So there's a story in some of Gnosticism that I just am going to call the story of Nerea. How many of you have heard of Noah? Okay, all right. So Noah's flood going on, right? He's building an ark, and Nerea, who is understood to be kind of a descendant of Eve, actually. Nerea goes to Noah and says, "You have a lot more room on this boat than like you're letting on. You know, this is a big boat, and there's a lot of people over here. Will you let us on?" He says, "No, you know, I was mandated to do this in a precise way." She sets fire to his boat, walks away. He rebuilds it. She does the same thing again. She asks, "Can you please let people onto this boat?" And he says no. She sets fire to it again. And he builds it one more time, and she realizes it's a losing situation. And she prays to God and says, "You know, can you please save us from this flood?" And basically the angels come and lift them above the waters. They don't even need a boat at all, right? And obviously that's very controversial in many ways. But it also helps remind us of the responsibility of humans to be able to make informed decisions about what is morally right, right? The same is true for Thunder Perfect Mind, where in a sense, God is represented as a woman. And really the polar ends of the spectrum, right? That the first and the last, the honored one and the scorned one, the whore and the holy one, the wife and the virgin, the mother and the daughter. And that there's a long series of lists of how the divine really encompasses the two poles and everything in between, right? The whole spectrum of the world. Now, why I bring these up is what happens when we push ourselves to try to understand folks who hold something very different from us, right? You don't have to accept these things. You know, that is not my goal here. I mean, I like them a lot, but you don't have to. But the thing here is, can you understand why this would be so valuable to someone, right? That they live their lives according to these kinds of principles. And what happens when we start thinking about a lot of religious communities in that way, right? All right. So lesson 3 is interfaith engagement needs teeth. And there might be a better way to say this. You tell me if you come up with a better way to say it, but really what I mean is, it's important to have good vibes. It's important to have positive communication. It's important to build relationships and understanding and all of those things. But it is also really important for us to do something with all of that. Because to be honest, the people who are fighting against these kinds of things do something about it, right? I mean, even thinking about our election coming up, right? There are people who are very legitimately doing something about countering the ability for marginalized religious communities to even exist in this country. So I wanted to bring up again the Oak Creek massacre. This does represent a lot of what my concerns are if interfaith engagement does not kind of give space for everybody to some extent. You know, if we hold the responsibility for interfaith engagement only on those who can fully engage, then we're not able to actually protect the rights of religious minorities. Right. So I do have a book that I would suggest to you, and I actually think it's even better audiobook. It's called The Gift of Our Wounds. It's between one of the sons of those who died in that massacre, and between a fairly well-known white supremacist at the time who really had a significant shift over basically the decade before. So, pardon Singh Kaleka and Arno Michaelis. The other kind of lesson that I didn't write up here, but I want to make sure is taken away, is that I do believe that we have to have some space for forgiveness also in interfaith engagement. And what I mean by that is, if people do better, you know, going forward, we really need to figure out how can we encourage that rather than how can we keep them out, right? Arno Michaelis is the former white supremacist. He currently has done a lot to reduce the amount of white supremacy today through engagement with both the Sikh community and particularly white Christian communities. He himself identifies as Buddhist now, so it's all over the place, right? And what happens if we don't kind of appreciate the paths that each of these people are on? All right, so I do want to ask then, you know, where are your wounds when it comes to interfaith engagement? For me, interfaith engagement and religious diversity is one of the most important things, right? I think a lot of us tend to think of it as sort of sprinkles on top of something else, right? Like any kind of advocacy is great, but advocacy with religion is kind of sprinkles on top, right? My congregation is great, but if we can be engaged in interfaith engagement, that's nice, right? What I want you to consider is how important this actually could be, right? Supporting religious diversity in our communities is about holding people to, you know, freedom of conscience. It's about being able to allow people to be themselves. It's about allowing communities to gather together. It's about figuring out how to build respect and trust between different people. The lessons you learn with interfaith engagement don't stop at religion either. You know, if you can build respect for people of a different religion, then I do believe you can build respect for people of a different race, a different gender, a different generation, a different profession. There's something about religious diversity and religion that allows us to kind of step in someone's shoes. And I use that hesitatingly, right? Because we've all heard some recent critiques of that, of not being able to fully do that. But I do believe that religion kind of gives us a little more of an ability than maybe some other things do. Yeah, that's the end of my main presentation. I just wanted to make sure that people walked away with some of these thoughts. And I'm happy to answer any questions or have any conversations or anything like that.
I have been really concerned about my faith. I just have a feeling it's moving away. That the original vision that we have is just not happening now. That we don't get together, we don't exchange ideas. I don't know, I'm fearful, and I'd like to know what you think we must do. What are a few top things we must do in order to make this vibrant in our, among the three of us?
Yeah, so there's a lot. I think when it comes to any kind of interfaith engagement, and this in particular, we firstly need to prioritize being humble. So a lot of I've heard a lot of people talk about original mission, original vision. I've heard people talk about this is what it used to be and things like that. To be honest, I don't think that matters that much. I think what matters is how are we going to make relationships work next, right? Stop worrying so much about pre-COVID, stop worrying so much about these buildings. Things are different and people change too. Not just the individuals, but who goes to each of these congregations change. I do think that we need to have more structures and commitments in place to each other. But also we need to recognize that the vision of what this is different for every person, honestly. And we need to somehow find a balance between appreciating that diversity, but also finding, again, some common ground too, sort of like I mentioned earlier, right? How can we balance the appreciation of difference on what this should be and be able to commit to each other that there are some things that it should be also, right? As a unified people. I also think that there does need to be a longer conversation about what exactly the role of those who are not necessarily part of the synagogue, the church, and the mosque are. I think that just needs to be a longer conversation. What?
Say more about that.
I think when you start talking about sort of original vision and mission and things like that, I think people mostly firstly, they're all over the place. But I think one thing is that there's something unique and special about the synagogue, the church, and the mosque's relationship, right? And there needs to be an appreciated, equitable place for anyone who wants to be involved that doesn't necessarily identify with those three congregations. And I think we just need to have a little more clarity around that.
I think after you are gone, you know, that there's enough people around here who can help with these ideas of getting together more or learning more, or just not letting it kind of twiddle away to like a sprinkle. Well, we can have a flood of understanding, perhaps.
Right. So firstly, I will say, I think the staff that are here are really wonderful, and very committed to making sure those things happen. I will also say that I think that we have to start thinking about what does that look like when especially when it comes to these three congregations, what does it look like to have a commitment to interfaith engagement, as, you know, Countryside, as Temple, as AMI, and can we all be on reasonably the same page about those expectations? You know, I mean, each of these congregations are in very different places, and they probably always will be. So what are the places that we can reach a common ground on, and really empowering everyday folks, you know, volunteers, and anyone who wants to be engaged with this kind of work to move the mission forward. Because to me, it's more about the mission, you know, to cultivate inclusive environments, to advance interfaith relationships and understanding. It's more about the goal than the process being perfect, right? the process has to continue. We have to make sure that we're continuously engaged with folks. We're education driven and relationship driven. But it's gonna take a lot more than any amount of staff or anything like that. Even if we had 40 people, it still would take whoever, right?
So it needs to come from people in each of those congregations who want to learn about each other, want to get to know each other, do things.
I think that's a key component, particularly for the commons. Yes, I think that that the synagogue, the church and the mosque. I mean, let me put it this way, okay? If I want Jews, Christians, Muslims to be friends, okay, and I'm not any of those three. Heck, even if I am one of those three, but if I'm not one of those three, how am I going to do that? I'm going to set up a place, an opportunity. I'm going to invite people. I'm going to try to communicate and engage people to come, okay? But at the end of the day, there still has to be a commitment for someone to show up, right? It still has to matter. And that's something that I will admit, I don't think the staff can do by itself. I think that takes a collaborative effort. And I think that there are people and I know, people in this room are really committed to that. It takes a village. It takes a town, probably more so than a village even.
When Roger and I moved here, I was so excited because I had looked you all up online. I went to the UCC website and I said, where am I going to go to church? And you were all still doing the hard work of getting here at that point. When we came, the church had just opened and you guys were still building. What I have seen is a lot of very hard work to build opportunities to do what you're saying, which is be in touch with each other. I can go to church all day long every day, and that's not going to improve my relationship with folks who are here that I see in other places. I'm not saying we do a great job at it. Getting old, getting tired, but I know enough when I walk into the room and see familiar faces that I see in other, we go to the temple. I'd be darned if I can read some of that music. But when they're going at a fairly slow pace and Joanne is really singing it, I can start to do that. If they didn't have it printed on the screen, I wouldn't know what I was saying. But I'm trusting that they know what we're saying and that they are important to me. They got to be important to me in the garden. They got to be important to me in the food delivery. You gotta do things with each other. And you have to make an intentional move to do that. Go to the mosque. The longest time I would not talk to the imam. And I was just too, I was afraid. Both of the imams, the one who has been there, the one who is there now, they're very nice people. They're very cordial. They're happy to have us around. They answer some of my, Abdullah said to me one day, how'd you like the scripture today? And I said, yeah, I was really surprised to hear a Christian scripture read in this place. And he looked at me and he said, it's not a Christian scripture. I was like, I said, my ignorance is vast. And I think when we realize that our ignorance is vast, and it's okay, but take opportunities to reach out. That doesn't address necessarily the leadership things that are going on. We've also gone through a pandemic. We've gone, and our community we've got through a pandemic and a pre-election. That's why I don't know what another term for that is. One right after the other, except awful. We have to give ourselves space to experience life as it's going on, but we also have to take some responsibility for how we're going to shape what we've been given. And we have been given a beautiful, beautiful opportunity.
And maybe to add, I think it's. One thing that I'm seeing in particular is there's a significant difference in how, in general, younger folks are understanding interfaith engagement to older folks in general. So why I'm saying that out loud in particular is the interfaith engagement of young folks is generally housed in the individual, right? It's open to the changing identities, it's open to seeking and it's open to those kinds of things. And I'm not saying that that's not true for others, but in general, there's a hesitancy, and I think we can see why. There's a hesitancy in associating with a particular identity a lot of the time. I mean, you can see that, like, who uses the term Christian the most in media, right? What does it mean when you say that to people? When, you have some of the same issues in the Jewish and Muslim communities too. It's just a little different. But like, we have to be thinking about what does it look like to have interfaith engagement with folks who don't necessarily have a clear identity, or they have changing identity, right? I've been here for almost 6 years. I'm not part of one of the institutions. But do any of you doubt that this is like one of the biggest priorities for me? Right. So how can we develop a culture where it does give space to people who don't quite fit in the boxes that we've set for ourselves? Right. I mean, even if this project was only about these 3 congregations, people change. There have been even just conversions between each institution, not like people are proselytizing, but people find meaning in other people's experience sometimes, and they switch. And there's been switch to every institution from every institution already. Right? How do we deal with that? We say, oh, it strengthens our own faith, but it's not quite that simple. We're trying to make a place for people, right? At the end of the day. And how can we make sure that culture is approved and appreciated, right? Because it's going to keep happening, right? There will be intermarriages, there will be switches, there will be people leaving and joining and all of that stuff. But at the same time, we have this campus and we have people who care about marginalized religious communities. They care about people being able to be themselves. They care about all of these things. How do we make sure all that is balanced? I don't have all the answers, but I hope that some of those lessons at least lead to some of the answers over time. Yeah.
As this is kind of a little look back on your 6 years here, I'm curious about some moments of impact for you. 2-part question: what moment or 2 do you think of as having the most impact on you while working here? And then what moment or 2 do you think of as you having a real impact in the work that you've done?
Well, I can think of a lot for both of those things. One that comes to my mind right now is partially because I just received multiple notes today about the impact of me being here, right? To folks who have been engaged for quite some time. I don't think Marilyn Hogemeyer would mind me saying that she sent me a very kind note. In part because she doesn't identify with any of the congregations either, but she's been involved for as long as I have. And that I remember when we had a conversation around that, it's like, I don't know quite how to engage because I don't really represent one of these institutions. And I remember her feeling very emotional about the fact that, you can be fully engaged without being part of one of these institutions. And she is very fully engaged, to any of you who know her, right? That was just like a couple hours ago, that's partly why it's coming in. I know one thing that I dream of for this commons is that these 4 organizations come together and see us as responsible for serving the community together. That's really what this is all about. And you can build relationships and understanding in the meantime. Let's do good for people. And you'd be amazed at how close people connect when they start serving the rest of the community together. And what I think of is the Yazidi community. So how many of you know who the Yazidis are? Okay, so short version is that they are a very small religious community from mostly Iraq, but the Kurdish region. They have some controversial beliefs, and they've been victims of over, I think, 100 genocides over the course of their history. We have the largest community of Yazidis in the Western Hemisphere in Lincoln, Nebraska. And we reached out, they tend to be working class. They're from the Middle East, but mostly working class, which puts them in a weird category for a lot of immigration in the area. And they just really wanted an opportunity to tell their story. That's one thing. But then also they wanted to find, how do we build, the first small temple to the Yazidi religion in the Western Hemisphere? So connected them with folks who had built buildings for cemeteries for the Jewish community, right? And we were able to connect them with people who knew how to develop a plan to have that kind of building and to be able to develop a plan to get money for that building. And that was an opportunity where we had, the Tri-Faith Center, folks from the synagogue, folks from the church and the mosque, all invested in making sure that this other religious community felt like they could be part of Nebraska, right? Part of the United States. And that's just a small thing. That took 2 days. And imagine if we made that commitment, right? That we are here to support religious diversity in the community, in the state, in the country, because that's what this symbolizes to people, right? This symbolizes we can have community regardless of the religious background. That's how people generally outside of the common see it. We can decide that we are going to get along. And we're going to build the things in place to make sure that happens. So let's do, in my opinion, what people expect of us.
So how is things like fundamentalism and proselytizing handled? I mean, if we want diversity, but how do you draw a line and say you're not going to, promote something that does something that is kind of contrary?
Yeah, I think it's fine to have boundaries. Just not boundaries on the basis of identity. Okay, so so for example, and I don't know if any of you are Catholic in the room, but there's some negativity towards the Catholic community because on the campus, because the administration is hesitant around LGBTQ issues, right? That it is reasonable in interfaith engagement if you've decided that part of your responsibility is to uplift and also appreciate the LGBTQ community, you can say, this is an expectation, you know, this, and. Or at least the expectation is, you're not gonna be negative about it, right? That we're not going to give you a platform for that, but. You know, you're welcome here, and it's not on the basis of being a particular religion. I also know William Barber identifies as evangelical Christian, right? Like, we have these categories, and it shouldn't be primarily based on religious identity. It should be based on what kind of actions are we able to accept and which ones are we not.
So could Catholics join then if they wanted to?
Okay, Catholic, there's lots of Catholics that are involved with Tri-Faith. They don't have a church here, you know,
Right, okay.
but yeah, there's lots of Catholics that are involved and that are inclusive to all the identities that we have.
I'm Catholic and I came to involve her through my work, but I also was searching because for what Jeremy stated, like. You know, the organization of you know, how it's organized itself, they're not accepting of all people, and I always had a problem with that, and I kind of found a home here, so I don't identify either with the three congregations here, but I feel like I think I found a home finally, and I wonder what you said, like the sweet spot maybe is a community, like you have open arms community, even if you're not part of one of the three congregations. Maybe the linkages between those three organizations can be like open arms and we're community and come here and we accept you for who you are.
Right.
I
Yeah.
just think there's a lot of walks of life that I think a lot of people are looking for that. I think organized religion, I think people are just trying to find spirituality, and so you find spirituality in community. But maybe you know, you symbolize a welcoming of spirituality of all walks or something, you know.
Yeah, I mean, people don't fit in our boxes, you know, I mean. However you relate to religion, pro, anti, neutral, you know, whatever identity, I mean, those things are still gonna be a little individual to you. And at the end of the day, people get to decide how they identify and what they actually believe or care about, right? So. My main thing is, you shouldn't turn away on someone on the basis purely on their religious identity. But if you have to have boundaries for the safety and sanity of your, you know, the inclusion of your community, you don't have to include exclusion, right? It's just. Don't jump to an assumption just based on someone's religious identity by itself.
Thank you.
Jeremy, there's one thing you said right in your presentation, you have to show up.
Yeah.
And showing up is something that I refused to do for a long time because of fear. Because I was afraid that I'm a Christian, I'm a devoted Christian, and I'm afraid that somebody is gonna try to change me. But I didn't realize that that's what needed to happen to me. I needed to change. And before we moved to Nebraska from Vermont, Judy talked about coming here, and I wasn't sure because people were gonna try to change me. I'm sure my wife knew that I needed to change. But I didn't know that. And the first Sunday we were here, we drove to this campus and I went past the mosque and I said, this is where I need to worship. I hadn't even seen church yet. And something in me changed. And we started working with the church and we started helping to deliver food to people on the first Saturday of the month. And I thought it was something that our church did. Well, yes, we were part of it, but we went over to the temple, we picked up things that an anonymous Jewish member purchases every month for 22 people. And over there, we did handing out the food at the temple for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And on July 25th, there was a big windstorm. Power was the way it was knocked out. around this whole campus. And so, I found out that there was no power in the temple, there was no power in church, and I assumed there was no power in the mosque. So I didn't go to worship, because usually I go to the mosque at 1:30 on Friday afternoon, and the temple at 6 o'clock on Friday evening. But this day, I didn't go to the mosque, and sometime later, I was talking to a Muslim that I didn't know who worked at the food distribution, and told him my story, how I decided not to go to the mosque that day because there's no power in the temple, there's no power in the church. And he said, and there's no power in the mosque either. So we worshiped with no AC and no lights, and he said, and you weren't there. And that's why I found that I'm not invisible. And what happened was, my fears are dispelled a bit, because I go and I sit in the mosque and listen to Arabic, and I have no idea what's going on there. I watch people kneel down, and I say, I wonder what that means, but I haven't asked anybody, even though I know a couple of Muslims. I can ask you. I don't know if the rabbi or the imam know my name, but they talk to me almost pastorally, like my pastor. And I would have been afraid to do that, and fear is still my biggest fault. I'm afraid that you're not gonna like me, or I'm not gonna like what you do, but I need to walk into it and live with that fear, and then it disappears.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most common things that I hear is people being nervous to offend, right? It's not usually like, oh, I'm afraid of like terrorism happening or something like that. It is almost always, I want to be so respectful that I'm scared to show up, right? And that takes two sides, you know, we have to be a good guest and folks have to be a good host, but at the end of the day, like, you gotta have the bravery, and I will admit that may be the particular responsibility of the Christian community. Just because of the difference in power in American society, that it's historically, in a sense, safer to go to a mosque as a Christian than it is to go to a church as a Muslim. Yes.
With the name tri-faith, this afternoon, there's been a lot of conversation about the three faith communities here. Could you share the importance of this spot here as the fourth organization?
Sure. So firstly, just saying what I think congregations' responsibilities are real quick. So in general, I mean, at the end of the day, these are three religious institutions. They have responsibilities for pastoral care, for supporting a strong religious community, for doing the work that they do. I personally believe that this institution should primarily represent a stance of inclusion for communities not as clearly represented here, but also as a somewhat outside group to support these three also, right? So let's say the I don't know, maybe the church, I'm just gonna pick on the church. They're the easiest ones to pick on. So let's say the church has something that is akin to a passion play. Okay, do we all know what I'm talking about?
No.
Well, basically a repetition of the crucifixion. Okay, there's a long history of that being kind of a call for anti-Semitism that a lot of Jewish folks know about, and not as many Christian folks know about. why I say that is because, sometimes. Sometimes you kind of need this outside perspective to help facilitate better relationships in the first place, right? So for example, maybe another example. So. Let's say, actually, I'll just give a real example. So who went to the Spirit of Galilee event? Okay, so the Spirit of Galilee event was inviting a Jewish, Christian, and Muslim person from the Galilee region to talk about kind of how they're doing peace in Israel, Palestine. There was a lot of controversy about it. But I will say that I do believe that we, as sort of the outside folks for that, should have been involved in how that event was portrayed and advertised and talked about and helped people get prepared for it. Not to say no or to say yes or anything like that, but there was an opportunity to recognize that, oh, the way this is portrayed might land on this subset of this community differently than you expect, right? I want you to think about how can we kind of resolve that issue before we have it, right? Because if you don't know how your message is going to be heard by another community and you say it, it's hard to take that back after the fact. So, and especially in tense times about difficult topics. And honestly, those kinds of things happen probably on a weekly basis to some extent, some bigger, some smaller, but in general, I mean, it just helps to have a little bit of an external perspective involved in the kind of internal conversations. Another example, although I wouldn't say it's quite this dynamic, but why do people go to a couples counselor, right? They don't go to the couples counselor for the couples counselor to tell them all the things that they need to resolve. So they do it to help the communication between the couple, right? They're not there to say yes or no even. They're really there to just kind of help bring up, oh, what do you think about this? How did this make you feel, right? Those kinds of things. It's not a perfect one-to-one for me because the dynamic's a little different, but I think that is a possible usefulness for this center and the staff and board that are associated with it. Yeah.
I think in interfaith work, we have a lot of different words. So there's tolerance without respect, there's respect without inclusion, there's inclusion, or as they say, common service. Then the other extreme is like, we're all just one race, we're human, or kumbaya. Is there a priority for this organization or as individuals? And is it okay sometimes just tolerance, just push for tolerance?
So, okay, so I'm not speaking organizationally or anything, it's just me. But I think tolerance is a reasonable response for certain actions that we don't love, but don't feel the need to protect someone from. I don't know. I mean, the truth is there's a lot of maybe not a lot, there's a few religious institutions in Omaha that I would say tolerate because I think some of it's harmful for people. But at the same time, I'm not gonna go outside and have any direct action against them necessarily either, because it's not necessarily harming people outside of the community that consented to it. So to me, that's kind of where tolerance lies. It's not caring about them. And I'm not saying that I don't care about them as people, but I don't care about their religious practice that much because there are more important issues to face, you know, whether we're talking about those who need to be inspired to engage more, or whether we're talking about those who need to be uplifted more or something like that. There are some folks that you can just kind of say, well, this isn't this bucket. They're not interested in engaging. They're not doing something so harmful that's worth directly acting against. They're not doing something so helpful that is worth engaging with. And that's to me where tolerance lies, but it's not the goal for the vast majority of, in my opinion, what I think interfaith engagement should be about. It's just kind of a necessary part of existing. Right. Any other questions, comments, concerns, critiques, compliments?
I'd like to just ask, how.
She left.
I was wondering how people get involved who aren't part of the tri-faith. Do they just walk in the door and ask?
Yeah, kind of.
See, I'm involved, I'm from Nebraska Zen Center. I'm a Zen Buddhist next door to Augustine Lutheran. So I come to these classes, I attend Temple Israel. Try to be involved as much as I can. So I think there is a way, but it would be helpful to know how to be more involved than I currently am.
Yeah, I'm an atheist. I've always been an atheist, and I think coming from Japan, religion has been very interesting to me, you know, having an outside perspective. And so when I learned about tri-faith, I think first, yeah, trying to get everyone, you know, kind of peaceful coexistence and work together is one thing. And another thing is, personally, the teachings of all these different religions, you know, combination of all the teaching is valuable for me. So I think both of those drive me to these events.
Yeah, it's a little bit like I mean, this is kind of a comedy book, but Holy Envy, the book is a little bit like that, where we don't have to be part of a particular community to appreciate, you know, another's religious experience, education, just personal experience, right? This is also, I mean, honestly, if I were to suggest someone who's moving to Omaha to get connected to folks, this is a good place to go, right? You end up becoming connected to a lot of different parts of Omaha in a pretty short amount of time, right?
I have a compliment.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for everything you've done for trying to. It's been amazing. Your teaching, your even keelness, your inclusiveness has been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
That doesn't mean it's done. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see when I'm next here, right? So, but yeah, thank you. And also, yeah, feel free to reach out anytime. My email address and all that stuff should be pretty available. So let me know, but
So in answer to the question, how do people get involved? I think Pam was gonna say. Well, we still have, I mean, you guys can come on in,
Yeah.
We have lots of actions. I'm here, James here, we're just here. So,
What is Carol, tri-faith, or which, you have an institution you're talking about in particular?
oh,
I mean,
the center.
The tri-faith, oh,
there's
that's
a Tri-Faith Center, I'm here Monday to Fridays, so.
And she's very responsive.
I mean, we have programs, we have book clubs, we have social opportunities. And really, those are kind of like what we were talking about earlier, you know, those are intended to be sort of platforms for people to connect with each other. The people who would like to be engaged can engage. We can't force people to engage, but we're trying to make sure that there's something for everybody. Maybe not every single event is for everybody, but over the course of a couple months or so, there's probably something for everybody with the tri-faith programming. Luke, Megan, Pam are wonderful and they come up with lots of cool stuff too, so.
I'll available on the website.
And also, honestly, these three institutions are open to visitors during their services, or if you call them, you can talk to them about ways to get engaged in other ways too. So, there are definitely paths. All right, well, thank you.
I have felt a real need for those of us at Countryside to really have in our bulletin what's going on this week at Tri-Faith. It just seems like that would help a lot for engagement.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
Well, it's on this, it's in the C10.
Yeah.
But for those in our age group, that's a real. Impediment. Some of us who need it on the table. in front of us.
yeah, and you know, if you ever have ideas of how we can connect with folks better, let folks know, okay, like. If it would be helpful to consider, you know, a paper handout every couple months or something, that can be, you know, a conversation, I'm sure. Yeah, things like that, so, yeah. I mean, thank you all for being here and for showing your support, I really appreciate it. I'll be around for a little while longer today and I'll be in the office tomorrow, but tomorrow's my last day, so. Keep in touch though, okay? Thank
Best
you.
wishes.
Thank you.